Found great, found great tenants for the house. Moving in with Kai tomorrow. Fresh start. Don't bother coming back to Portland. The text arrived while I was standing in a cemetery in Minnesota, dirt still fresh on my mother's grave. Same phone that had been buzzing all week with condolences and funeral arrangements. I read it 3 times, then looked at the attached photos. Strangers unloading a moving truck into our driveway. Our front door propped open with boxes marked kitchen and bedroom in handwriting I didn't recognize. Our house. The one we'd bought together 4 years ago. The one with my workshop in the garage and my mother's antique piano in the living room. The one Lydia was supposed to be watching while I handled Mom's affairs. My name is Ezra Castellanos. I'm 38. Been working as a software architect in Portland for the past decade. The kind of guy who plans everything twice, backs up his backups, and keeps detailed documentation of every major decision. Professional habit that served me well in code and, apparently, in life. I was supposed to fly back to Portland that evening. Had been gone for 8 days dealing with Mom's sudden passing. Heart attack at 64, no warning, just gone. Lydia had insisted I shouldn't worry about anything at home. Said she'd handle the mail, water the plants, keep an eye on things. Said I should focus on family and grieving. Take all the time you need, she'd said when I left. I've got everything covered here. Everything covered. Right. I stood there in that Minnesota cemetery, November wind cutting through my funeral suit, staring at photos of strangers moving into my house while my wife apparently moved out. The audacity was breathtaking. The timing was surgical. She'd waited until I was 1,200 miles away, emotionally devastated, and legally unable to do anything about it. But here's the thing about being a software architect. You learn to think in systems. You learn to anticipate failure points. You learn to build safeguards into everything that matters. And you definitely learn the difference between a bug and a feature. This wasn't a bug in our marriage. This was a feature of Lydia's personality that I'd been documenting for months. Let me tell you why this story matters and why you should trust what I'm about to tell you. I've been building systems for 12 years. Enterprise software that handles millions of transactions, databases that can't afford to fail, security protocols that protect people's entire digital lives. My job is literally to anticipate every possible way something can break and build safeguards against it. I'm the guy companies call when their systems get compromised. I've seen every type of digital betrayal, every backdoor attack, every social engineering scam. I've helped Fortune 500 companies recover from insider threats, employees who seemed trustworthy until the day they weren't. Pattern recognition isn't just my profession, it's how my brain works. In Portland's tech scene, I'm known as the methodical one, the guy who reads every line of terms and conditions, who keeps encrypted backups of everything important, who never assumes good intentions without verification. My colleagues joke that I'm paranoid, but paranoia is just pattern recognition applied to human behavior. When Lydia and I bought our house in the Hawthorne district 4 years ago, I handled all the paperwork, read every clause, understood every contingency, made sure both our names were on everything important, the mortgage, the insurance, the utilities, all joint accounts, all properly documented. I even kept digital copies of every signature, every notarized document, every piece of correspondence with our lender. Lydia used to tease me about my digital hoarding, called it obsessive how I saved every email, every text, every photo with metadata intact. You act like you're preparing for a lawsuit, she'd laugh. Who keeps records of everything like that? Someone who's seen enough systems fail to know that documentation saves lives. Someone who understands that trust needs verification. Someone who's learned that the most devastating attacks always come from inside the system. Standing in that cemetery, staring at those photos of strangers in my house, I realized I'd been running diagnostics on my marriage for months without consciously knowing it. The signs had been there, the behavioral changes, the unusual access requests, the subtle system modifications. I just hadn't been ready to admit what the data was telling me. I called our property management company first, Meridian Properties, the local firm we'd used when we briefly rented out our basement apartment 2 years ago. Maybe there was some mistake, some misunderstanding. "Mr. Castellanos," said Jennifer, the account manager I remembered. "Yes, your wife contacted us 3 weeks ago about setting up a full house rental. Said you'd decided to relocate for family reasons. She had all the proper documentation, power of attorney, signed agreements. Everything looked legitimate. 3 weeks ago. While I was dealing with Mom's declining health, flying back and forth between Portland and Minneapolis, Lydia had been setting up the rental, professional timing. "What kind of lease did she sign?" I asked. 6-month minimum, first and last month's rent paid in advance. The tenant seemed lovely. Young professional couple, excellent references. They moved in yesterday with a full year's rent paid up front. My heart sank. A full year up front meant serious money, meant tenants who wouldn't be easy to remove, meant Lydia had planned this for maximum impact and minimum reversibility. "I need to see all the paperwork," I said. "Of course. Though I should mention, your wife specified that all communications should go through her during the transition period. Said you were dealing with a family emergency and didn't want to be bothered with rental details." Family emergency. Right. She'd used my mother's death as cover for stealing my house. I hung up and immediately called our mortgage company, Chase, where we'd refinanced last year to get a better rate. If she was renting the house, she might have violated our primary residence clause. "Mr. Castellanos, I see here that Mrs. Castellanos contacted us 2 weeks ago about temporarily relocating due to family circumstances. She updated your contact information and mailing address. All very standard for people dealing with elder care situations. 2 weeks ago." The timeline was becoming clear. While I was making funeral arrangements and handling my mother's estate, Lydia had been systematically preparing to erase me from my own life. "What address did she give you?" I asked. The representative gave me an address I didn't recognize, somewhere in the Pearl District. Expensive area, the kind of place that required significant income to afford. "And she updated the contact information to remove me?" "Oh no, sir. You're still the primary contact. She just added an alternate address for correspondence during your family situation. At least she hadn't been able to remove me entirely from my own mortgage. Yet." I stood there in the cemetery parking lot, rental car running for heat, adding up the scope of what she'd done. House rented with long-term tenants. Mortgage company informed of temporary relocation. Property management company handling everything through her. New address in an expensive neighborhood. This wasn't impulsive. This was methodical, calculated, and executed with the precision of someone who'd been planning it for weeks. To understand why this betrayal cut so deep, you need to know about the house. Not just any house. The first real home I'd ever owned. Bought with money I'd saved for 8 years, and a down payment that included the last gift my mother ever gave me. Mom had been a nurse in Minneapolis for 35 years. A single mother who raised me on night shifts and overtime pay, who taught me that security came from planning ahead and saving every penny you could. When I graduated from college and landed my first tech job, she insisted on giving me $10,000 toward a house down payment. "Real estate is the only thing they can't take away from you," she'd said, pressing the check into my hands. "As long as you keep making the payments, it's yours. Build something stable." That money, combined with years of careful saving, had become our house in Hawthorne. A 1920s craftsman with original hardwood floors, built-in bookshelves, and a workshop space in the garage where I could tinker with hardware projects. The kind of house Mom would have loved but never could have afforded. I'd brought her to Portland twice to see it. Once, right after we bought it, when Lydia and I were still happy, still planning a future together. Mom had loved the kitchen, the way morning light came through the big windows, the small garden where Lydia grew herbs and vegetables. "You did good, mijo," she'd said, running her hands along the original crown molding. "This is the kind of place where you raise a family, where you build something that lasts." The second visit was last Christmas, when Mom's health was already declining, but none of us knew how fast things would go. She'd been weaker, more tired, but still insisted on helping Lydia bake cookies in that kitchen she loved. They'd spent hours together, and I thought it was beautiful, my wife and my mother, bonding over recipes and stories. I'd found out later that was when Lydia started asking Mom questions about my finances, my plans for the future, what would happen to the house if something happened to me. casual questions that seemed like normal family conversation at the time. Now I understood they'd been reconnaissance. Mom died 3 weeks later. Heart attack while she was getting ready for work. The same woman who'd worked double shifts to give me a stable life. The woman who'd sacrificed everything so I could have the kind of security she'd never known. Standing in that cemetery, I realized Lydia hadn't just stolen my house. She'd stolen the last physical connection I had to my mother's dreams for me. The space where Mom's piano sat, where her Christmas cookies had been made, where her hope for my future had taken root. Some things can't be replaced. Some violations go deeper than money or property. This was one of them. Lydia and I met 5 years ago at a tech conference in Seattle. She was working marketing for a startup. I was presenting on database security. Beautiful, smart, charming in that effortless way that made everyone in the room want to be her friend. We connected over craft beer and shared complaints about Portland's dating scene. The first 2 years were good, really good. She was supportive of my work, seemed genuinely interested in my projects, even learned enough about coding to ask intelligent questions. We moved in together after 8 months, got married after 2 years, bought the house 6 months later. She had this way of making big decisions feel romantic. "Let's build something together," she'd say when we were house hunting. "Create the kind of life we both want." I was completely sold on the vision: stable relationship, beautiful home, dual income, maybe kids someday. But something shifted after we got the house. Subtle at first, then more obvious. She started complaining about the mortgage payments, even though we'd carefully calculated what we could afford. Started making comments about how much my computer stuff cost, even though my home office equipment was a business expense that actually made us money. The complaints escalated into larger questions about our financial priorities. Why did I need such expensive hardware? Why did I insist on keeping so much money in savings? Why was I so paranoid about joint accounts and shared passwords? "Normal couples share everything," she'd say. "You act like you don't trust me." But it wasn't about trust. It was about good security practices. In my world, you never give anyone more access than they need to do their job. You compartmentalize. You maintain audit trails. You assume that today's trusted user might be tomorrow's security breach. Lydia called it paranoia. I called it professional habit. The real warning signs started about 6 months ago, right around the time Mom's health began declining. Lydia became intensely interested in our financial situation, not just spending money, but understanding our entire asset structure. She wanted to know about my retirement accounts, my investment portfolio, the equity we'd built in the house. "I should understand our finances better," she'd say. "What if something happens to you? I need to know how everything works." Reasonable request from a spouse. Completely normal conversation for married couples to have. Except for the timing. Except for the way she asked. Not collaborative planning, but information gathering. Except for how she'd get frustrated when I suggested we should both learn about each other's finances, rather than me just briefing her on mine. Looking back, I can see the pattern clearly. The questions always came when I was distracted or stressed, during Mom's health scares, after long work days, when I was too tired to wonder why she needed specific account numbers or why she was taking notes. She was systematically mapping our financial infrastructure, while I was too emotionally drained to notice. The escalation started 3 months ago when Mom had her first serious health scare. Chest pains that turned out to be a warning sign of the heart attack that would kill her 6 weeks later. I flew to Minneapolis immediately, spent 4 days in hospital waiting rooms and doctor consultations. When I came back, Lydia had reorganized my home office, cleaned up the papers, filed everything neatly, threw away what she called junk mail and old statements. Said she wanted to help reduce my stress by creating a more organized workspace. I appreciated the gesture, until I realized she'd thrown away bank statements, investment account summaries, and property tax documents. When I asked about them, she seemed genuinely confused. "I thought those were just duplicates of stuff you keep digitally. You're always saying paper is inefficient." Strike one. Information had been removed from my environment during a vulnerable time. 6 weeks later, during Mom's final hospital stay, Lydia started asking more specific questions. Not general, How are our finances questions, but detailed queries about property ownership, mortgage terms. What would happen if one of us needed to relocate for family reasons? I'm just trying to understand our options, she'd explain when I questioned the specifics. Your mom might need long-term care. We should know what's possible if we need to help her financially, or if you need to spend more time in Minneapolis. Logical reasoning. Caring wife thinking ahead about elder care responsibilities. Except mom was already dying, and we both knew it. The questions weren't about helping mom. They were about understanding what assets would be available after mom was gone. Strike two, information gathering disguised as caregiving concern. The final escalation happened during mom's last week. I was essentially living at the hospital, sleeping in chairs, handling both medical decisions and funeral arrangements. Lydia stayed in Portland, said someone needed to keep things stable at home. She called me every day with updates that seemed supportive. Don't worry about the house, I'm handling everything. Don't worry about bills, I've got them covered. Don't worry about mail, I'm sorting everything important. What I didn't know was that she was also making other calls, to property management companies, to moving companies, to whoever Kai was, preparing the infrastructure for my removal while I was burying my mother. Strike three, active deception during maximum vulnerability. The day mom died, Lydia was unusually emotional on the phone, crying, saying how sorry she was, how much she'd loved mom, how she wished she could be there with me. It felt genuine, like grief we were sharing together. Now I understood those weren't tears of grief. They were tears of guilt. She was crying because she knew what she was about to do to me while I was at my lowest point. She'd already signed the rental agreement, already given notice at her job, already moved her important belongings out of our house. She was crying because she was about to destroy my life, and some part of her still had enough humanity left to feel bad about it. Here's where my professional training kicked in. When you work in cybersecurity, you learn that the worst possible response to a breach is panic. Panic makes you reactive instead of strategic. Panic makes you focus on the immediate damage while missing the larger attack pattern. I stood in that cemetery parking lot, staring at those photos of strangers in my house, and forced myself to think like an incident response specialist instead of a betrayed husband. First rule of incident response: don't alert the attacker that you know about the breach. Let them think their attack is working while you gather intelligence and plan your countermoves. I didn't call Lydia screaming, didn't send angry texts demanding explanations, didn't book the first flight back to Portland to confront her. Instead, I put my phone on airplane mode and sat in that rental car for 20 minutes, thinking through what I knew and what I needed to find out. What I knew: Lydia had rented our house to tenants with a year's rent paid up front. She'd moved to an expensive address in the Pearl District. She'd done this while I was handling my mother's funeral. She'd been planning this for weeks, maybe months. What I needed to know: how complete was her information about our assets? What legal vulnerabilities had she created? Who was Kai? And how long had this been going on? What mistakes had she made in executing her plan? Because here's the thing about people who aren't security professionals. They always make mistakes. They get overconfident. They assume their target won't fight back intelligently. They focus on the immediate gain while missing the long-term consequences. I turned my phone back on and sent a simple reply to her text. Understood. We'll make arrangements from this end. No emotion, no accusations, no indication that I was doing anything other than accepting the situation. Let her think I was too grief-stricken to fight back. Let her think she'd won. Then I did something Lydia didn't know I could do. Something I'd learned during my consulting work with law firms and insurance companies. I activated the digital forensics tools I'd installed on our home network 6 months ago. See, when Lydia had started asking those specific financial questions, my security instincts had triggered. Not enough to confront her directly, but enough to start documenting everything. I'd installed network monitoring software that logged every device connected to our home Wi-Fi, every website visited, every file transferred. I'd told myself it was just routine security hardening. Better safe than sorry. Professional paranoia applied to personal life. Now I realized it might have been the smartest thing I'd ever done. From that cemetery parking lot, using my laptop and a cellular hotspot, I logged into our home network remotely, and started pulling data. 6 months of digital activity. Every search Lydia had made. Every website she'd visited. Every document she'd accessed or downloaded. Every communication with property management companies. Every text with Kai. Every planning session for this betrayal. She thought she was being careful. She thought I was too distracted by Mom's illness to notice. She thought deleting browser history was enough to cover her tracks. She'd been wrong about all of it. What Lydia didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that I'd been preparing for exactly this scenario for 8 years. Not because I expected her specifically to betray me, but because I'd learned early in my career that the most devastating attacks always come from trusted insiders. Remember what I said about paranoia being pattern recognition applied to human behavior? Well, I'd seen this exact pattern before. During my second year in cybersecurity, I'd worked a case where a company's financial officer had been systematically transferring assets to personal accounts while the CEO was dealing with his father's terminal illness. Classic exploitation of emotional vulnerability combined with insider access. That case had taught me something important. The best defense against insider threats isn't just monitoring, it's compartmentalization. You design systems so that even trusted users can't cause catastrophic damage. I'd applied that principle to my personal life in ways Lydia never understood. Yes, both our names were on the house deed and mortgage. Yes, we had joint checking and savings accounts. Yes, she had access to what appeared to be our complete financial picture. But what she'd accessed wasn't our complete financial picture. It was the operational layer I'd designed for day-to-day expenses in normal life. The real assets were compartmentalized. 8 years of maximizing my 401k contributions had built substantial retirement savings in accounts she couldn't touch. A separate LLC I'd created for my consulting work held intellectual property and business assets she'd never known existed. Investment accounts opened before our marriage remained individual property under Oregon law. Most importantly, the house itself had a protection mechanism she'd never discovered. See, when we'd bought the house, I'd insisted on what seemed like an overly complex ownership structure. Instead of simple joint ownership, I'd created a family trust that owned the property. Both our names were on the trust documents, but the trust had specific provisions about rental income, property management, and what constituted valid authorization for major decisions. Lydia had been able to rent the house because she was a trustee, but she'd violated the trust agreement by doing so without proper authorization and by attempting to claim rental income as personal property. Under Oregon trust law, that made her actions legally questionable at best. But here's the really beautiful part. I'd included a clause in the trust documents that automatically triggered if either trustee attempted to use the property for unauthorized purposes. A clause that gave the other trustee the right to assume full control and remove the violating party from all property decisions. Lydia thought she'd locked me out of my own house. In reality, she'd triggered a legal mechanism that would give me complete control over the property and the rental situation. She'd also made another critical mistake. When she'd rented the house through Meridian Properties, she'd signed the property management agreement as an individual, not as a trustee. That meant she was personally liable for any breach of the actual ownership structure. The rental she'd arranged wasn't just unauthorized, it was potentially fraudulent. From that cemetery parking lot, I made 3 phone calls. First to my attorney, David Chen, who'd helped me set up the trust structure 4 years ago. Second to a property law specialist David recommended. Third to a forensic accountant who specialized in asset recovery. By the time I hung up from the third call, Lydia's perfect plan was already falling apart. She just didn't know it yet. The beautiful irony was that she'd used my mother's death as cover for stealing my house. But Mom's death had also triggered inheritance laws that made my individual property claims even stronger, and given me the emotional motivation to fight back with everything I had. She'd picked the wrong victim at the wrong time using the wrong method. Now she was about to find out what happened when you tried to hack someone who actually understood security. I flew back to Portland 2 days later, but not to the house that was no longer available to me. Instead, I checked into a downtown hotel and spent the morning in my attorney's office, finalizing the legal strategy we'd developed over multiple phone calls. David Chen had been busy. In 48 hours, he'd filed an emergency motion for trust administration, contacted Meridian Properties about the unauthorized rental, and prepared cease and desist notices for both Lydia and her tenants. More importantly, he'd reviewed all the digital evidence I'd collected and confirmed what I'd suspected. "She's violated the trust agreement in multiple ways," David explained, spreading documents across his conference table. "Unauthorized rental, misrepresentation of authority, attempted conversion of trust assets to personal use. The property management company is also potentially liable for failing to verify proper authorization." "What about the tenants?" I asked. "Innocent parties with a valid lease from someone who appeared to have authority. We'll have to work something out with them, but legally, they're in a vulnerable position too." At 2 p.m., I called Lydia, first time we'd spoken since her initial text message. "Ezra," she answered, and I could hear the wariness in her voice. "I wasn't sure when you'd call." "We need to meet," I said. "There are some legal issues with the rental that need to be resolved." "What kind of legal issues?" "The kind that are better discussed in person. Are you available this afternoon?" Silence for a long moment. "I suppose. Where do you want to meet?" "David Chen's office. You remember David? He's the attorney who helped us set up the trust for the house." Another silence, longer this time. "Why do we need an attorney present?" "Because apparently we have different understandings of how property ownership works. I thought it would be helpful to have a professional clarify things." She agreed to meet at 4 p.m. Probably figured she could explain her way out of whatever complications had arisen. Probably thought I was still too grief-stricken to mount any serious challenge to her plans. She walked into David's office at exactly 4:02, dressed professionally and carrying a folder I assumed contained rental documents. She looked confident, prepared, like someone who'd thought through all the angles. "Lydia," David said, standing to shake her hand. "I'm sorry for your loss. I know Ezra's mother meant a lot to both of you." "Thank you," she said, and I watched her face carefully. Still no real grief there, just the appropriate social response. "Let's sit down," David continued. "We have some complex issues to work through." He started with the trust documentation, walking through the ownership structure and the specific clauses that governed property use. Lydia nodded along, probably thinking this was just legal formality before we worked out some kind of separation agreement. Then David opened the second folder. "These are the documents you signed with Meridian Properties," he said, spreading them across the table. "And these are the authorization requirements from the trust agreement. Do you see the problem?" I watched Lydia's face as she read through the paperwork, watched the moment she realized that her confident understanding of the situation might be incomplete. "I had authority to rent the house," she said, but her voice was less certain now. "I'm a trustee." "You're a trustee with specific limitations," David replied. "Limitations that require mutual consent for any rental arrangements and written authorization for any rental agreements longer than 30 days. You signed a 6-month lease without proper authorization. Ezra was unavailable. His mother was dying. Which is exactly why the trust includes provisions for emergency situations. There's a specific protocol for when one trustee is temporarily incapacitated. You didn't follow that protocol." David opened the third folder. "More importantly, you've been in violation of the trust agreement for several weeks now. The rental income has been deposited into personal accounts rather than trust accounts. You've misrepresented your authority to both the property management company and the tenants. And you've attempted to exclude the co-trustee from property decisions without legal justification." Lydia was pale now, but still fighting. "This is all technical. We're getting divorced anyway. The property will be divided as part of the settlement." "Actually," David said, opening the fourth folder, "divorce proceedings don't override trust agreements, and trust violations can affect property division significantly." He showed her the cease and desist orders, the motion for emergency trust administration, and the legal analysis of her potential personal liability. "The rental you arranged is legally questionable," he explained. "You may be personally responsible for any damages to the tenants, any losses to the trust, and any costs associated with resolving the situation." Finally, David opened the last folder. "And then there's this," 6 months of digital evidence, screenshots of her communications with Kai, records of her research into property management companies, documentation of her systematic information gathering about our finances, evidence that this betrayal had been planned for months, not executed impulsively during a family crisis. "This shows premeditation," David said quietly. "A deliberate plan to use family tragedy as cover for asset conversion. The timing alone makes this potentially fraudulent, not just a civil matter." Lydia stared at the evidence for a long time. When she finally looked up, the confidence was completely gone. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want you to fix this," I said. "Clean termination of the rental agreement with proper compensation to the tenants. Return of all trust assets to appropriate accounts. Resignation of your trustee position. Clean divorce with no claims on individual property." "And if I don't?" David answered that one. "Then we proceed with all available legal remedies. Trust violation claims, potential fraud charges, personal liability for the rental situation, and a contested divorce where all this evidence becomes part of the public record." Lydia was quiet for a long time. Finally, she opened her folder and pulled out a single document. "I'll need a few days to arrange things," she said. "You have 72 hours, I replied. "After that, we proceed without your cooperation." She signed the document, a resignation from the trust and an agreement to cooperate with the resolution process, and left without saying goodbye. 3 days later, the tenants were relocated to a comparable property at Lydia's expense. The rental agreement was terminated, and I had my house back. The week after Lydia signed the cooperation agreement was a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and logistics. True to her word, probably because she understood the alternative, she handled the tenant relocation professionally. Meridian Properties found the couple a comparable house in the same neighborhood. Lydia covered their moving expenses and the rent difference for the remainder of their lease term. It cost her approximately $18,000. Money she apparently had available, which answered some questions about how long she'd been planning this exit strategy. David Chen handled the legal paperwork with surgical precision. Trust administration was transferred entirely to me. The rental income that had been deposited in Lydia's personal accounts, nearly $4,800, was recovered and properly allocated. Her resignation as trustee was formalized and recorded. More importantly, her violation of the trust agreement created a legal precedent that would affect our divorce proceedings. Under Oregon law, attempting to fraudulently convert marital assets could impact property division significantly. David made sure the divorce filing included all relevant documentation. "She'll probably try to claim emotional distress or temporary impairment due to grief," he warned me. "Standard defense for poor decision-making during stressful periods." "Will that work?" "Not with 6 months of premeditation evidence. You can't claim impulsive grief reaction when you have documented proof of systematic planning." The house felt strange when I finally returned to it. Not damaged exactly, but different. The tenants had been respectful, hadn't left any mess or caused any problems. But someone else had been living in the space where my mother's piano sat, where her last Christmas cookies had been made. I spent the first night just walking through the rooms, reclaiming the space mentally. This was still my home. Still the place Mom had loved, where her dreams for my stability had taken physical form. Lydia had tried to steal that, but she'd failed. The divorce itself was anticlimactic. Once the trust violation evidence was part of the court record, Lydia's attorney recommended settlement rather than litigation. She kept her car, her personal belongings, and half of our joint savings accounts. I kept the house, my individual retirement accounts, and my business assets. She also kept the $8,300 she'd taken from our joint checking account right before leaving. I didn't even ask for it back. Consider it a settlement for emotional damages and the cost of her education about trust law. The final papers were signed on a Thursday in March. Lydia didn't attend the final hearing. Her attorney handled everything. I heard through mutual friends that she and Kai had moved to Seattle, where he apparently worked in marketing for some wellness company. Fitting, really. She'd traded a secure life with someone who loved her for an uncertain future, with someone who specialized in selling people solutions to problems they didn't know they had. That evening, I sat in my workshop, The garage space that had been mine, then briefly belonged to strangers, and was now mine again. I pulled out my laptop and wrote a detailed incident report about everything that had happened. Professional habit, but also something more. This wasn't just about documenting a personal betrayal. This was about understanding how trusted insiders exploit emotional vulnerability, how good people can be manipulated during crisis periods, and how proper security planning can protect against even intimate attacks. I was already thinking about how to share this information with other people who might need it. Other tech professionals who trusted too much. Other people dealing with family crises who didn't realize how vulnerable they'd become. Other sons and daughters who might need to protect their mother's legacies from people who saw grief as opportunity. The betrayal was over. The education was just beginning. 8 months after the divorce was finalized, I got a call from David Chen. Not about my case, that was long settled, but about a referral he thought I might find interesting. "Remember that property management company, Meridian Properties?" he asked. "They're facing a lawsuit from another client. Seems they've had problems with unauthorized rentals before. Your ex-wife wasn't their first problematic case." It turned out that Meridian's document verification process was less thorough than they'd claimed. 3 other property owners had discovered unauthorized rentals arranged by people with questionable authority. The company was facing liability claims that could exceed their insurance coverage. "Thought you'd want to know," David said. "Your documentation helped establish a pattern of negligence that's strengthening the other cases. Justice comes in unexpected forms sometimes. Lydia's betrayal had exposed a systemic problem that was now being addressed legally. Other people would be protected because of the evidence we'd gathered. But the real karmic justice came 6 months later, through a mutual friend who still followed social media drama more closely than I did. "You might find this interesting," Rachel said, showing me her phone over coffee. It was a Facebook post from someone I didn't recognize, but the story was familiar. A woman in Seattle describing how her boyfriend had convinced her to invest her savings in his innovative life coaching business. How he'd used her financial resources to lease expensive office space and buy marketing equipment. How he'd promised they were building something together, a new kind of wellness company that would help people transform their lives. How he disappeared one day with all the equipment, all the money, and all the client contact information, leaving her with lease obligations and business debts she couldn't pay. The woman's name wasn't mentioned in the post, but the boyfriend's name was Kai. "Is this your ex-wife's new guy?" Rachel asked. I studied the post more carefully. The timeline matched. The location matched. The business description matched what I'd heard about Kai's work. "Looks like it," I said. "Should you warn her somehow?" I thought about it for exactly 30 seconds. No. Lydia had made her choice. She'd chosen to betray someone who loved her for someone who promised her excitement and financial opportunity. She'd chosen immediate gratification over long-term security. She'd chosen to exploit my grief for her personal gain. Now she was learning the same lesson my mom had tried to teach me years ago. Security comes from building something stable with someone you can trust, not from chasing get-rich-quick schemes with people who make big promises. The difference was that Mom had learned that lesson through poverty and hard work, then tried to pass the wisdom on to me. Lydia was learning it through betrayal and financial loss, with no one to cushion the impact. Some lessons have to be learned the hard way. Some people have to lose everything before they understand what they had. 3 months later, I heard through the same mutual friend network that Lydia had moved back to Portland. Not to our old neighborhood, she couldn't afford that anymore, but to a studio apartment in Southeast. Working retail again, trying to rebuild her credit, single again. I felt something when I heard that news, but it wasn't satisfaction or revenge. It was just sadness. Sadness that someone I'd once loved had chosen such a destructive path. Sadness that she'd hurt herself as much as she'd hurt me. Sadness that she'd probably never understand how much she'd thrown away. But mostly, I felt grateful. Grateful that I'd protected what mattered most. Grateful that I'd learned to recognize patterns and prepare for them. Grateful that my mother's dreams for my security had survived someone else's attempt to exploit them. Grateful that I'd chosen to build something stable rather than chase something exciting. The house was still mine. The legacy was still intact. The lesson was still being taught to other people who needed to hear it. That was enough justice for me. 2 years have passed since that text message in the Minnesota cemetery. I'm writing this from my home office, the same room Lydia once reorganized while gathering intelligence for her betrayal. Same desk, same view of the garden where she used to grow herbs, but the energy is completely different now. The house feels like home again. I've made some changes, updated the security system, renovated the kitchen where Mom's last Christmas cookies were made, converted the basement into a proper workshop space. The bones of the place are the same, but it's evolved into something that's entirely mine. More importantly, I've been sharing what I learned. The incident report I wrote after the divorce became a blog post about protecting assets during family crises. That blog post became a series about digital security for personal relationships. The series became speaking engagements at tech conferences and legal education seminars. Turns out there's a huge need for this information. Most people in tech are great at protecting their company's assets, but terrible at protecting their personal ones. Most people understand network security but ignore relationship security. Most people have sophisticated backup systems for their data, but no safeguards for their emotional vulnerability. I've helped dozens of people implement what I call trusted insider protocols for their personal lives. Not because I want everyone to be paranoid about their relationships, but because I want people to understand that love and verification aren't mutually exclusive. You can trust someone completely while still maintaining appropriate security boundaries. You can share your life with someone while still protecting the assets that ensure your long-term stability. You can be emotionally open while still being strategically careful. 6 months ago, I started dating someone new. Her name is Sophia. She's a therapist who specializes in grief counseling, and she has her own story about learning to balance trust and protection. We met, ironically, at one of my security seminars. She was there because she'd had her own experience with financial manipulation during a vulnerable period. We talk openly about our protective measures. We both maintain individual accounts alongside joint ones. We both understand why the other person needs verification processes and documentation habits. We both know that real security comes from mutual respect for boundaries, not from unlimited access to each other's lives. Trust but verify, I told her early in our relationship, explaining my approach to financial planning and asset protection. Verify but still trust, she replied, which might be an even better way to put it. She understands why I keep detailed records of everything. She understands why I designed our relationship to have appropriate compartmentalization. She even appreciates the family trust structure that protects the house, not because she wants to benefit from it, but because she understands it represents my mother's legacy and my commitment to building something stable. Last month, I took her to Minnesota to visit Mom's grave. It was the first time I'd been back since that terrible day when everything changed. "Thank you," I said to the headstone, with Sophia standing quietly beside me, "for teaching me to be smart about it, for making sure I could protect what you gave me." The wind picked up in the oak tree, just like it had 2 years earlier, but this time, it felt like approval rather than warning. On the flight back to Portland, Sophia asked me something that made me think. "Do you ever regret being so careful? Do you ever wonder what might have happened if you just trusted completely?" I thought about it for a long time before answering. "I regret that I had to be careful," I said finally. "I regret that someone I loved chose to exploit my grief instead of supporting me through it. I regret that my mother's death became the cover for someone else's betrayal. But do you regret protecting yourself? Never. Because protection isn't the opposite of love. It's a requirement for love. Real love respects boundaries. Real love doesn't exploit vulnerability. Real love doesn't see tragedy as opportunity." She nodded, understanding something that Lydia never had. Some people are worth the risk, and some people aren't. The trick isn't learning to trust blindly. It's learning to recognize the difference before it costs you everything that matters. That lesson was worth every penny of my father's inheritance, every hour of careful planning, every moment of vigilance during the darkest period of my life. The house is secure. The legacy is protected. The wisdom is being shared. And I'm finally ready to build something new with someone who understands that real security comes from mutual respect, not unlimited access.